All right, this is very exciting for me. I have to be honest. I have been watching content either starring this man or produced by this man for over 3 decades. Never in a million years did I ever think that our first interaction, our first interview, our first conversation would be about basketball. But here we are. This is the way things go. You know this man. He is the former executive producer of World Championship Wrestling, then became a WWE Hall of Famer, one of the most influential figures in the history of professional wrestling, the one and only Eazy-E, Eric Bischoff in the house. Hello, Eric. Thank you for doing this. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here, to be honest.
I thank you for that. There's so much that I want to talk to you about, but this is primarily a basketball show, so I do want to talk to you about the 25th anniversary of a really big deal in your career and in the history of pro wrestling and in the history, of course, of World Championship Wrestling. And I know you've talked about this a little bit, but since we are approaching that anniversary next month, July will be the 25th anniversary of the 1998 Bash at the Beach, the highly anticipated and much talked about tag team match involving Karl Malone and Diamond Dallas Page, Dennis Rodman and Hulk Hogan, a massive moment in the history of your career and the company as well. Just wanted to reminisce a little bit if we can, and I may pepper you with some pro wrestling specific questions at the end. First, let's start here. I believe the first time you did business with Dennis Rodman was in 1995. Do you recall the first time you were ever introduced to him?
It may have been at Bash at the Beach in 95, if I'm not mistaken. It's hard to remember, but I did
It
meet
was.
Dennis once prior to him, becoming active with us in the ring, so to speak.
Okay, so it was Bash at the Beach in 95, but Hulk Hogan was a good guy. He was a
Right.
babyface, the red and yellow. And you brought him in just as sort of like a bit player, if you will. He wasn't quite as famous back then as he later became because he hadn't
Mhm.
joined the Bulls just yet. But when you were approached with this idea, and as you know, at this point, you're trying to take over WWF, do you recall why you thought that this would be a good idea? And did it end up being a good idea? Like, was the relationship good at the time? Was it a good experience working with him?
It was an interesting experience. Let me first say, because I'm very honest about these things, and sometimes being honest about things comes off as being negative, and I don't mean to do that with regard to Dennis. But Dennis is a very unique person. I have nothing but respect and affection for Dennis. He's a very, very good human being. But if you don't take the time or have the time to get to know him, you don't really see that. You see the presentation that we've come to know, the very outrageous and colorful and slightly bizarre at times character. But the person inside, the private person inside, is a very generous person. He's a very kind person, and he's really, really smart. But I didn't know any of those things when I first met him. When I first met him, I enjoyed meeting him. I'm not a huge basketball fan. I never really have been, so I wasn't like awed by him as an athlete. But my experience with him was very positive. He's kind of an introvert, really, until you get to know him. And looking back at that, all I can think about was he showed up on time. He did what he was asked to do. He seemed to be having a really good time. And that was it. And as far as it being a good experience, on a scale of 1 to 10 for that night, yeah, I would give it a 6 or a 7. It was what it was. But I think more importantly, it created a relationship that would become very important later on.
Yeah, and in '97, it seems like the relationship takes another, takes another step because now he's on the Bulls. Now he's, the Worm and Rodzilla and all that stuff. And he actually, a lot of people talk about the '98 tag match, but there was a Bash at the Beach in '97 coming off him winning a championship with the Bulls, where he actually competed along with Hulk Hogan and in a tag match against Lex Luger and the Giant. Do you recall being? I actually was impressed with Dennis, coming off of an NBA Finals and you tall guy, lanky guy, wrestlers, NBA players in wrestling, like sometimes they could come across as a little bit awkward. I actually thought he did a good job. Do you recall, being impressed with what he did in the ring in that tag match?
I recall being blown away.
Okay.
Here's the background on that. We had to get Dennis together with Hulk, and we had to lay the match out. And Dennis had never been in a wrestling match before. So we agreed that we would get together a few times before the pay-per-view, and we kind of worked it around Dennis's schedule, and we found a ring that we could train in and all that. And, Dennis did show up a little bit late for training. I'm not going to lie about that. And we were a little bit concerned because Dennis didn't seem into it. He was he was just disconnected. Like when he did finally show up, he didn't really look anybody in the eye. He was very quiet. He was almost withdrawn in a way. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, this is going to be a nightmare. What are we going to do with this guy? And we got him up on the ring apron. And I remember I was watching, from a distance, and I'm watching, and I can't remember who the trainer was in there with Hulk, but Hulk's in there with Dennis and trying to show him, okay, this is how you do, this is how you do this, and this is how you do this. And Dennis is just looking, not saying a word. And Hulk said, okay, Dennis, give it a try. And he hit fifth gear, did it perfectly, executed whatever it is they were working on. Like it was like an Irish whip off the rope, something very basic, but he executed it. His footwork was perfect. First time, it was like, whoa, wait a minute. Where did he get that from? It's like he had a photographic memory. Like you showed him something. If it involved physicality, you just walked him through it one time and he'd do it. It was freaky. And then, of course, once he got into it and they started having fun, there was nothing that you couldn't show him anything that he couldn't do pretty well the first time out of the gate. It was amazing, really.
When you have him, like mid-season, he showed up to a pay-per-view like the day after a Bulls game. How does that work? Like, do you have to get permission from the Bulls, from the NBA for that to happen? How does that go down?
No, I was operating under the better to ask for forgiveness than permission kind of business model. Because if you look back, Turner Sports had the rights to NBA playoff games at the time. So I was walking, and my boss was Harvey Schiller, Dr. Schiller, who was the president of Turner Sports and also oversaw the NBA franchise for Turner. So I was kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, and I just kind of did what I needed to do, and I didn't ask too many people for permission. It was really up to Dennis. If Dennis wanted to show up, I was more than happy to have him there. I didn't pressure him to show up. I didn't ask for permission if it would be okay if he showed up. Dennis just did what he wanted to do. That's Dennis.
Did you ever get in trouble, or did you ever get someone say like, hey, it's getting a little too close for comfort here?
No, I never did.
Wow.
And I should have. Now, I don't remember what game this is. You probably will.
Oh, yes. You're talking about 98 now, right?
Probably. There was by this time, our relation, not just mine, but everybody's, especially Hulk's, because Dennis to this day loves Hulk. I mean, they're very good friends. And I had developed my own relationship with Dennis, and it was pretty good. And I remember telling Dennis and Karl, I said, look, guys, if it doesn't affect the outcome of the game, and there's any opportunity for you to just jack your jaws a little bit and maybe look like you're going to do something, you don't have to do anything. But if you could just kind of like the Old West, man, when the two gunslingers come out and they're slowly reaching for the guns, just give me that. Just give me that. And of course they did. And I was like, yeah, but nobody knew that but Karl and Dennis and I.
Okay, so at the time, I'm 16 years old. I'm a huge basketball fan. I'm a huge pro wrestling fan. I'm watching that game. I believe it was Game 3 of the 1998 NBA Finals, and they start to get into like a wrestling match on the ground going for a loose ball.
Right.
And they continue to tangle, and they continue, and there's a sequence there. And Bob Costas is calling it. And as they're looking at the replay, it's Bob Costas and Isaiah Thomas, because the clip is still online, so I went back and rewatched it yesterday. And he references the fact that regrettably, Dennis Rodman and Karl Malone are going to compete in one of those, he calls it like wrestling shows next month. And they're getting into it now. And I couldn't believe that Bob Costas was referencing, even though he didn't say it by name, a WCW pay-per-view on the NBA Finals broadcast. I thought that was like a massive moment for you and for the company.
It was.
Were you watching that live, or did someone tell you? But really?
Oh, yeah.
You must, I mean, the grin on your face when that was going on.
It was... I popped so loud. I think I was home alone. My wife was doing something, but I popped so loud for that. That was so awesome because I didn't think they would do it. I thought they said, yeah, hey, if we get a chance, we'll have a little fun. And I kind of forgot about it. Then I was watching the game, went, oh my God, I'm going to get fired.
At that point, did you have the deal in place for them to compete?
Oh yeah.
Okay, the
Yeah.
following month. That would be
Yeah.
akin for those that may like, or and I don't even know if you get the reference, but that would be akin to like right now, it's the Nuggets and the Heat in the NBA Finals. Nikola Jokic, who's the biggest star on the Nuggets, going up against Jimmy Butler next month in a WWF pay-per-view. But Rodman was 1,000 times more popular. I mean, he was one of the most popular athletes in America at the time. And so let us go to '98. How did that deal come together? Because I understood, based on what I've read, that it was brought to you to bring Malone involved by DDP, but you wanted Macho Man to be his tag partner. Is that accurate?
No, that's not accurate at
Okay.
all.
All right. That's
Not at
what
all.
he has said in interviews, DDP, that he
Wow.
had to try to convince you to put him in because you wanted Macho Man to team up with Malone.
I mean, I guess there may have been, 5 minutes of conversation at the very beginning, but Carl, I was introduced to Carl by DDP. DDP and Malone had become friendly somehow. I don't know how, but it's Diamondale's pace. Once he sets his mind to something, there's no stopping him, no matter what it is. And I think he was at a game and threw up the diamond cutter sign, and Carl threw it back. So, DDP recognized it. Oh, Carl must be a wrestling fan, and went and engaged and had a conversation with him. Next thing I know, I'm on a plane from Atlanta to Salt Lake City, and blink my eyes and I'm sitting in Karl Malone's house with DDP and Karl Malone and Karl's wife and working out the details of a deal. Perhaps there was a moment on the way there. I may have said, hey, who do we team him up with? And DDP was probably already thinking me, and
Yeah.
I was thinking maybe Savage, but it ended up being DDP, and I'm glad it was. I mean, he deserved it.
Okay. That moment where Rodman skips practice in the middle of the NBA Finals to go to Nitro. You're telling me you didn't get any heat for that from anyone? I mean, he got fined. It was a huge deal. Obviously, they've talked about it on the Last Dance documentary. No heat from you.
No,
Wow. Were you nervous?
no. I I was fairly cocky at the time, and I was feeling we were doing pretty well at the time. It's funny how when you're doing really, really well and you're blowing ratings out of the water and you're making money hand over fist, you can get away with some stuff that if things were going badly, you wouldn't be able to get away with. So I was kind of riding a wave at that time. I wasn't too worried about it.
Were you surprised that he did that? That
Yes.
Rodman, you were.
Yes.
Was it your idea for him to skip
Nope.
practice? Whose idea
Nope.
was it?
His?
He just volunteered, "Hey, I can come by."
Yeah. He just
and
didn't want to go to practice. He wanted to go to Nitro.
and you of course said yes.
Sent a limo for him, of course.
Did you guys pay his fine or did he pay his own fine? Do you
No, I think
recall?
he paid his own fine.
Wow. And then at that point, like again, these clips are still online. Like Phil Jackson is answering, Michael Jordan is answering questions about him being on Nitro. You must be on cloud nine right now.
It was such great press for us.
Yeah.
I mean, every syllable of those interviews, whether it was Phil Jackson or Michael Jordan or Bob Costas and his comments from the year before, whatever, all of those conversations, every syllable of those conversations were ringing the cash register. And it's funny because I took a lot of heat from the wrestling. They call themselves journalists, but you know the deal. The peripheral wrestling media, we'll call them that. It was like, oh, Bischoff, so he's a jock sniffer. He just loves bringing in celebrities. He's overpaying. I paid Dennis Rodman $1 million to participate in a pay-per-view, including the TVs that went up to it and the rights to use his name and likeness and all that. There's no way I could have purchased the amount of media that we received by including Dennis in our pay-per-views. I could have purchased that media for $2 million. We got so much press and coverage. And my thinking was, at the time I used to listen to, Morning Drive all the time, FM Morning Drive. And it's a little bit of rock and roll, but it's a lot of sports talk in the mornings. Right. And I thought, man, if we can do something to get radio stations all over the country talking about WCW. And then Dennis, came into our lives. And I thought, wow, this is going to work. And it worked so well. We got so much coverage and promotion as a result of that. Like I said, it was the best money we've ever spent. Same with Carl. Carl got the same amount of money that Dennis did. Neither one of them were really tough to deal with when it came to money. They were doing it because they wanted to do it.
I appreciate the fact that I'm asking you about things that happened 25 years ago, and I've done some research here, so I totally understand if some of the details may be foggy. But do you recall ever hearing about the fact that WWF was trying to sign Dennis, and did that put you into an extra gear to try to take him away? I understand maybe Shane McMahon was trying to cut a deal with him. Do you recall anything about this?
No, that's true. That is true. I was in Atlanta. I had a meeting I was at the Airport Marriott in Atlanta meeting somebody. And I got there about 45 minutes or an hour early because I had some other calls I had to make. And I wanted to make sure I was there early because I don't like being late, believe it or not. For those of you that don't know, I stood Ariel up yesterday and was supposed to be on an interview, and I completely zoned out and forgot about it. But
No problem.
yeah, I was sitting in that Airport Marriott, and I got a call from Hulk Hogan. And he said, "Hey, brother, Dennis Rodman wants to hear from you." Shane McMahon reached out to Dennis, talked to him about doing a deal, but Hulk told me that Dennis, because he was friendly with Hulk, would rather do it in WCW. But he said, "You're going to have to call him right away because the deal's on the table." So I dropped whatever I was doing and called Dwight Manley, who was Dennis's agent at the time, and said, "Hey, I heard your guys interested in maybe, dancing a little bit with us." And he said yes. And probably 24 hours later, we had a deal in place.
Wow. Did you ever hear from WWF or maybe down the line say like, "You MFer, you took our deal"?
No, that never came up. It's
No?
funny. All the time I spent in WWE, I was there for 4 or 5 years, I guess, as a talent, and 4 or 5 months as an executive. But in all the time I was there, it never, those types of things never came up.
And at that point, you're kicking their butt, right? And right, 98, like this is post NWO launching.
Oh, yeah.
And I believe that was one of your most successful pay-per-views of all time, the 98 Bash at the Beach. Perhaps even the second most successful, do you recall?
I couldn't tell you.
Okay. But it was a big deal. Like I think over 500,000 buys.
It was a massive deal. And we were printing money at that point in time, early 98, mid 98. It wasn't until the fourth quarter of 98 that things started getting silly as a result of the AOL Time Warner Turner merger. But at that point in time in July, we were printing money.
He wins the NBA championship, and you have a big Nitro right before, like, I don't know if it was like the go home one, as they say in the business, the last one before the pay-per-view, but pretty darn close. And he no-showed. Do you recall this?
No.
He no-showed. Yes.
What did he no-show? Did he no-show WCW?
He no-showed Nitro, yeah.
Huh.
And you were, and this is when Hogan says he's trying to call him, and you in all your interviews talking about it, you kind of take it in stride. And you're like, "That's Dennis. He'll show up when we truly need him to show up, i.e., the pay-per-view." But I'm just wondering if at any point you were nervous, truly, that he wouldn't show up for the pay-per-view just because it was.
No,
such a
I
big
wasn't.
deal.
I mean, he was. I don't want to say flaky because that's a pejorative. He's just unpredictable, and he was moody. He would get moody, but I'm not sure that he was totally committed. It wasn't like he was contractually obligated to be at Nitro. A lot of the appearances that he had, especially during the season, were, "Hey, if he can make it, he'll make it," type of thing. Kind of like when he wasn't, and when he skipped practice to come to Nitro. But I was never worried about it. Like I said, I don't want to pretend that Dennis and I were super tight. We weren't. We were very friendly, and we had a good rapport. But I had a better rapport with Dwight Manley.
Okay.
Because Dwight was on the business side, and that's what I was concerned with primarily. Hulk had the relationship that the anchor relationship, the friendship that we needed with Dennis. I had a good business relationship with Dwight Manley. So I was never concerned.
Manley, I do believe, represented Karl Malone as well, right?
Yeah, it made things easy, didn't it?
Yeah, super easy. And the pay-per-view went off. Obviously, it was a success, but people look back on the match with a little disappointment. And I think the story is he was up all night, and he was a little sloppy in that match. He wasn't the '97 version of Rodman that we saw. Do you remember watching that and being disappointed?
I won't say disappointed. I mean, it was obvious that Dennis wasn't quite at his best. But I think that had a lot to do with the fact that he'd been there before. He'd been in that ring before now. It wasn't new to him. He probably wasn't as worried about screwing up as he perhaps was the first time out. So he was a little bit less focused, I guess. And perhaps he was out the night before because that was, I'm sure that happened in the NBA as well. He was a machine at that time. He was frightening to hang out and party with.
Did you ever party with him?
Yeah.
And like you've been around wrestlers, right? They're notorious for partying. Would you say he was at a different level?
Let's put it this way. I went out with Dennis one night. Oh, this is a funny story. I can't even tell the whole story.
No, you can tell.
No, I can. No, okay. I can't. But we were in New York City. We had a Howard Stern appearance the next day. And I think Dennis was already going to be in New York anyway. And Hulk and I flew into New York with Jimmy Hart. Jimmy Hart kind of went everywhere with Hulk. And we decided to go out and drink one night. And it was like 3 or 4 in the morning. And at that time, not anymore. I can't party like that anymore. But at that time, I could go pretty well. There was nothing for me to sit down and drink. It's almost embarrassing to say, but in the right situation and the right timing, I could sit down and drink, 12, 14, 16 beers throughout the course of an evening and feel pretty good about it, and I could keep up with Hulk for the most part. He's quite a bit bigger than me, so I had to be a little careful, but, pretty much drink for drink because Hulk really wasn't a super hard drinker. I could keep up with Hulk. By about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, Hulk and I looked at each other and went, we got to get out of here. We just couldn't keep up with him. And he wanted to go and go and go. But yeah, I tapped out. I had to tap out that night.
I have heard you tell a version of this story. There's a whole second part that you have told before. You know this, right?
Yeah, I've told it in our private shows when I know there's nobody recording.
Oh, I've seen it on YouTube where I think you had to get him to go to the Howard Stern show because it was like a 7 o'clock taping.
Yeah, it was a 7 o'clock taping, and all of us were hung. Everybody was super hungover except for Dwight Manley and Jimmy Hart.
Wow.
And this was, we had a whole 2 hours sleep, right? Maybe 3 at that point. And we were at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And alarm went off. It was like, okay, we got to get Hulk up. And Hulk is like when you try to wake Hulk Hogan up, it's like pushing a freight train uphill. I mean, he's just, once you get him going, it's okay. But getting him going is just brutal. He's just slow rolling, and I think that's just the way he's always been. So I assigned Jimmy to get Hulk going. And I said, Dwight, could you go get Dennis? Dennis had a room right next door to us, but he had a big suite. And Dwight went over a couple of times, knocked on the door. Dennis wouldn't answer. And now Hulk's just about getting ready. Probably 45 minutes have gone by now. Hulk's just about getting ready to go. We can't find Dennis or get Dennis to answer the door. So finally, Dwight says, here's the key. Go in. See if you can get him up. I said, you go in. You're his manager. No, he'll be fine. Just you go in. So I went in and I opened the door, and I'm going to be delicate here as I can. I opened up the door, and it was a suite. So I walked into the room, and I hear noises. I couldn't make out what those noises were exactly, but I knew that somebody with a pulse was in the next room. And of course, I opened the door, and Dennis was having a great time. Let's put it that way. And I stood there, and like any red-blooded American, I went, oh, Dennis, we got to go, Dennis. And as I'm turning around to walk out, I'm kind of sneaking a peek as I go. And I'm not going to mention the lady's name because I'm just not. But yeah, it was a hell of a way to start the day.
What a character. By the way, and I'm not insinuating that this was the person that was there, but he was, in a very well-publicized relationship at the time, talked about on the documentary as well. I always wondered why you guys didn't try to bring Carmen Electra on Nitro. Was there ever any talks of that?
And I'm glad you mentioned her name and not me, because I can say I didn't say a word.
I was just thinking of relationships that he's had. And
yeah,
that was a famous one.
I wish you could. have the visual that I have still. We actually did when they got no, they got married, right? Yeah, they got married for a minute.
Yeah, for a minute. Yep.
And then there was an NBA strike in February.
Yep.
And I got a call from NBC, a guy by the name of Gary Constantine, who used to be the executive producer of The Tonight Show. And that's how I got to know Jay Leno, and we got to do all that stuff that we got to do over at NBC. And Gary and I are still friends to this day. I got a call from Gary saying, "Hey, Eric, we've got a big hole in our schedule here." And I ran it up the flagpole. And if WCW thinks that they can create a special to fill in one of our 2-hour holes in prime time, we'd love to have you. I got an invitation to do a 2-hour special on NBC. And the idea was, and I think it was on Valentine's Day. It was either Valentine's Day or the day before I think it was the day before or day of. And we had this idea that, because we've always had weddings, right? In wrestling, It's kind of a thing. I thought nobody's ever had a divorce. And they were still amicable. It wasn't like a hostile thing. It was just, yeah, you go your way, I'll go my way, whatever. We'll meet on the weekends occasionally, type of thing. Right. And she was up for it. Early discussions, and we were going to have her on the show, and we were going to go the opposite of a wrestling wedding and do a wrestling divorce, and then have a big brawl spill out as a result of it. But the brain trust at Turner Broadcasting at the time, because I had to get permission because it was doing something on another network, right? And I had to get permission, so I went to Harvey Schiller and said, "Hey, I've got this amazing opportunity, and what do you think?" And I got shut down by Turner Ad Sales. The geniuses at Turner Ad Sales didn't want WCW on any other network but Turner. I was to this day, I'm still dumbfounded.
And this would have been a one-off.
Yeah.
And they didn't think that the opportunity to be on this massive platform would have come back and helped them.
No, I don't know. I don't know what their logic was. I just got a hard no. And these were people that were much more senior than I. So it wasn't like I could corner them in the cafeteria and ask them, "What the hell are you thinking?" I couldn't do that. It was just a flat out no.
And did you then try to take that idea and put it on Turner?
No.
Died with that. What?
It just died.
No.
Yeah, it just died. I think part of it, Dennis was excited to do something on network television. He'd already done wrestling, and we'd pretty much gotten everything we could get out of that with Dennis. It wasn't like he was going to end up in the ring as his next career or anything. It was fun for me. It made a couple bucks, and we had fun, and it worked for us. But I think by that time, Dennis's infatuation with being in the ring was pretty much satiated.
And would you say that was apparent in his last appearance in '99 against Macho Man? It just didn't feel quite the same, quite as big.
Yeah, but again, I think the new car smell had worn off.
Yeah.
It just was. He didn't have the same adrenaline. He wasn't as jacked up about it as he was initially. And I think just because it wasn't scary for him anymore. Been there, done that.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Did you only do one match with Malone? Or no, he was in the Leno match too, right?
He was in a Leno match.
He was in a Leno match. Okay. Overall, easy guy to work with?
No, wait a minute. Oh, you're talking about Carl. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Carl was great. In fact, I was just in Salt Lake City. And I don't know if Carl still lives in Salt Lake City, if he's back down in Alabama or where he is. I've lost track. I haven't talked to Carl in 7-8 years. But I was in Salt Lake City recently, and I drove by his car dealership, and I thought, I'm going to go in and talk to the general manager and tell him who I am. Hopefully he'll recognize me, and see if Carl still lives in the area, because Carl was a great guy to hang out with. He was about as grounded of a human being as anybody I've ever met. I don't know. Have you ever met Carl?
I've never met Carl. No, I've never met him.
Such a solid citizen. Just you wouldn't know, obviously when you see him, he's fairly impressive physically. But if you didn't know, if you got dropped out of one of the UFOs that are flying around Las Vegas right now and were introduced to Karl Malone, you would never guess that he was the superstar that he was, because he was such a just down to earth guy.
To that point, in all your years of being involved in the wrestling world, and a big part of wrestling is the celebrity cameo, if you will. You know, Mike Tyson with WWF was a major turning point for them. At around the same time, who was the best celebrity slash athlete that you brought in to work with?
I really enjoyed working with Dennis, just on a personal level. He was just so interesting and fascinating that it was fun to work with him. Karl was easy. Karl was just the easiest person I've ever worked with. But I really enjoyed Kevin Green a lot because he was like a little kid. He was so excited and he brought so much enthusiasm and effort and passion to it, to the ring, that it was hard not to really, he really stood out to me. Steve McMichael, Steve gets you look back at his matches, and I think Steve got so excited. He wanted to do more than he was capable of doing. And, he's an athlete. He's competitive. So he sees Ric Flair in there doing certain things, or he sees Arnie Anderson, forgetting that these guys have been doing this even at that time for 20 years, right? It takes a minute to learn how to do all that stuff. And they make it look so simple. And of course, Steve being, an athlete, being competitive and just loving what he was doing, much like Kevin Green, would go out there and try to do things that he just really wasn't quite ready to do live TV. And he had a couple moments there that stood out that weren't the best, but Steve was a lot like Kevin Green, man. He brought so much passion to it, and he was having so much fun for a good period of time. And then he kind of Steve went off the rails a little bit and probably spent a little bit too much time doing enough things he shouldn't have been doing that it took its toll on him for a bit. But he was a great guy and a good friend.
Dare I ask, who was the worst?
I never had a bad, ever
Okay.
had a bad, take that back.
Oh.
Nah.
Hmm.
I was going to say Snoop Dogg, but my interaction with him was so limited. That's probably not fair. He didn't even really know who I was. So I wouldn't expect that he would have been any more professional than he was. But that was the only time that I ever hit a speed bump, was working with Snoop Dogg, and it was just for a minute. And it was while I was in WWE, by the way. As far as WCW goes, every celebrity that we ever worked with, I had Charles Barkley, Shaq, Kevin Green, Mongo, obviously Malone, Dennis. Can't think of who else we had. George Foreman,
Right.
Muhammad Ali. I got to become friends with Muhammad Ali. It was one of the experiences that I cherished the most in my career, was getting to know Muhammad Ali, traveling over to Pyongyang, North Korea with Muhammad Ali, and developing a genuine friendship. So much so that in 97 or 98, I was invited by New Japan Pro Wrestling. They actually flew me, my wife, and my two children over for a big New Year's Eve show. And little did I didn't know, but Muhammad Ali was going to be there as well. And a couple of years before that, Muhammad Ali and I and others went to North Korea. And that's where we developed a relationship. And I'll never forget this. I walked into the arena, the Tokyo Dome, and went back to the green room, VIP room, whatever you want to call it. And there was Muhammad Ali, and I'm with my son and my wife and my daughter. And Muhammad sees me, and I go over to him to shake his hand, and he's holding my hand, takes me over to a couch. He had to whisper in order to understand him. I'm going to try not to cry when I tell the story, because every time I tell the story, I break down. He asked me if I thought that he embarrassed himself when he was lighting the torch at the 96 Olympics.
Wow.
He said, did you see the opening ceremony? And I said, of course I did. And he said, do you think I embarrassed myself? Because of, he was shaking. And I welled up. I said, Muhammad, it was one of the greatest moments in sports. I seriously, my eyes welled up. I couldn't hardly even talk for a second. I assured him that I thought it was one of the greatest things I ever seen, because it was.
Right.
And he just nodded his head. So, okay, that was it. And then he went over and was having fun with my son and joking around.
Wow.
My son was like 14 at the time, and somewhere. Howard Bingham. I don't know if you know the name Howard
Yes.
Bingham, but
Yep.
Howard Bingham was there. He was the photographer. And I remember him taking a photo of Muhammad and my son Garrett, and Muhammad was giving him a big hug. And I've been trying to track Howard. I know Howard's no longer with us, but I met his son, who was also in North Korea, believe it or not. And I'm trying to track him down and see if there's any way to find that photo, because I'd give an arm and a leg for it.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Ariel Helwani Show. If you want to check out some of our old episodes, or if you want to stay up to date with all the great things that we are doing here, please do like and subscribe to this here page. Trust me, some really cool things are coming up.